Hey, and welcome back. If you've followed my channel for some time, you've seen that I've been on a journey to build a drum set that is great for gigging and, most importantly, hauling around. Now, I've built a few different kits over the years, and usually my go-to is to purchase shells from Nordic Shells out of Minneapolis. And this year I was able to have the good fortune of traveling out there and touring the shop for my Off the Beaten Path series. Now, while I was out there and learning about everything they're doing, the owner, Dave West, was really helpful to me in deciding what might be the next steps for me in building my next set. A few weeks after that video came out, he called me and graciously offered to build me a set of shells so that I could put my next set together. And after a number of weeks of waiting for these custom shells to arrive, they've showed up today. So let's go check them out. All right, so let's go ahead and go through these shells and I can show you what I picked out. Now, to start, all of these are a combination of walnut and maple. When I was talking to Dave, he definitely understood that I love the aesthetic of walnut, but maybe the weight of it and the sonic characteristics might have not been exactly what I was going after. So what we decided to do was do a custom shell with walnut interiors and exteriors, but then the middle plies are maple. Now for the two toms, like this one here, these are 6-ply shells, and he's already cut bearing edges on them. They're already cut down to the depth I've wanted, so that's probably going to make this a much easier process. But we have a 12 by 7 inch tom. This is a 14 by 12 inch tom. And then this is a 20 by 12 inch bass drum. And this one is actually 8 plies to be a little thicker so that it would be a little bit more robust for mounting a tom off it and the Spurs and all the other hardware that's going to go on there. And then in addition to the 3 shells, he sent me out a pair of hoops here. I could have gotten these hoops in a matching walnut finish, but I kind of like the offset aesthetic of something a little bit brighter to contrast the dark, rich walnut shells. So these are just maple kick hoops. And he's already routed in a round over on one side of each of them, so I won't have to do that either. And if you're not super handy, Nordic has a lot of services for cutting down the depths, doing edges, even sanding to a certain degree that you can do right when you order, and that'll save you time as you put together your shells. So I think the next step for me is going to be sanding these down a little bit more. I'm going to do clear coats on everything. I think I'm going to go with something satin or semi-gloss as opposed to a high gloss to let the wood kind of stand out in a more natural way. And then we'll drill it out for hardware and talk about what I'm going to order for everything else I have to put on this set. But yeah, let's get going. As I brought these upstairs, I was hoping this would be a fairly quick process with the shells already cut to their final depths and bearing edges added to both sides. Nordic does offer a sanding service, but I knew it wouldn't take long for me to go through these shells with 150 and 220 grit sandpaper to smooth them over before finishing. As I sanded, I noticed the color of the walnut dulling out a bit, but I knew the finish would help bring out that rich darkness, so I wasn't too worried. As I mentioned before, I wanted to do a semi-gloss clear coat on these shells to give them a polished look, but not be overly glossy and let the wood grain be the star of the show. I'm a big fan of spray polyurethane because I can apply it in very thin coats, and it saves me from needing to sand between each coat. It also dries in about 2 hours, so I can do 4 to 5 coats in just one day. For the hoops, I did use a high gloss poly because I think on maple it pops a little bit more. I did 4 coats before going over these shells with a very fine sanding block just to smooth out the finish a bit, and then I went ahead to add a very thin final coat. After waiting overnight for these shells to fully cure, I then brought them downstairs to begin layout for hardware and assembly. I started with the rack tom and got it set up on my layout mat to mark out 6 evenly spaced lines across the shell for lugs. The lugs I'm using are from Champagne Drum Company, and require a small single hole in the middle of the shell. So after transferring my markings across the depth of the shell, I came back and marked halfway between the edges. I use a punch to create a small divot on these markings so that when I come in to drill, the bit won't drift at all. These lugs don't use a swivel nut, so there's almost no margin for error in the holes for hardware. After attaching all of the lug plates to the shell, I then brought it up to my workbench to secure all the threaded rods through. This part definitely took some practice to align everything perfectly so that it would thread through the shell and plate and into that rod, but after doing it a few times, it got much easier. Since I was pretty nervous about everything fitting perfectly, I decided to do a dry fit with heads and hoops at this point, just to make sure all of my measurements were indeed correct, and luckily, everything seemed to tune up great. I then took off the hoops and heads so that I could drill out for the air vent grommet. I kept this hole in the middle of the shell to match the lugs, but drilled a much larger hole so that I could attach this metal grommet through and tighten it on with the nut from the backside. Next up was the floor tom, which was pretty much the same process, including laying out the drum for 6 lugs again. I know plenty of people would prefer 8 lugs on a drum this size, but I've grown to really like a 6-lug drum not only for toms, but snares, and even on small bass drums as well. It allows you to crank up a little tighter on the head before getting the same results in terms of pitch to an 8-lug drum, and as an added bonus, it creates a little bit less mass on the shell. 6 lugs also works great for adding 3 floor tom legs, as they can be evenly spaced between every other lug on the shell. So while I was laying out the placement for these lugs, I went ahead and measured out the placement for floor tom legs as well. I then again repeated the process of dry fitting everything together before marking out the final placement for floor tom leg brackets and the air vent grommet. After getting all the holes drilled, I then went and secured on all the brackets and grommet before reheading this drum and getting it tuned up. Moving on to the bass drum, I made a slight alteration to the layout, instead using 8 lugs, because even though I'm a big fan of 6, it's simply just too much space between tension points on a 20-inch shell like this. Going through the process of layout and marking all 3 of these shells really taught me that I need to get this mat permanently mounted to some sort of lazy Susan wheel. Even with this workbench on wheels where I can easily move it around, it's a total pain to reach over certain areas of the table and try to mark things up, where if I could just turn the mat and stay in the same spot, it'd be much easier to mark up. While I laid out all 8 spots for lugs, I also made sure to add a marking evenly between the top 2 lugs for the air vent grommet, and also added some markings halfway up the shell on either side as a reference for where to drill bass drum spurs eventually. After setting everything with a punch and then going through and drilling all the holes, I went in and added the lugs, which had gotten much easier to do by this point, and then again did a dry fit with hoops and heads. Since the bass drum hoops don't have fitted slots like a normal tom hoop, I didn't have much anxiety about everything fitting and working out, but of course it's still important to have balanced tension coming from evenly spaced holes. After getting this drum completely assembled and tuned up, I added my DW clamp-on Spurs, which are great because they require no drilling at all, and could be a good temporary option for me to test out this drum prior to committing to drilling any holes for something permanent. So I've reached a halting point in this project because I'm still waiting on some parts to show up to finish everything out, but that didn't stop me from using these drums over the weekend, since I had 3 gigs on Saturday, and I used this set for all 3 of them. The first was with a 5 or 6 piece band doing covers and originals, and this was outdoors at a fall festival. Then I brought them to a corporate party playing with a jazz trio, and then finally to a bar later that night where I was playing with the 9 or 10 piece version of that band from that morning. Overall, I thought these drums did super well. In the morning, I had them tuned kind of medium, then I tuned them up for the jazz gig, and then in the evening, I tuned them real down low and thuddy, and I thought they sounded great at all of these gigs. Additionally, they were super lightweight to carry around, and I got a lot of positive comments about how they looked. So this definitely has me excited to finish these drums out. Now, I did put new drum heads on the top and bottom because with how nice these shells were, I just thought it would be worthwhile investing on my own to get new heads for everything, and then also invest in new tension rods and hoops to go along with that. I haven't ordered the tension rods or hoops yet, just because I wanted to wait until I put things together to figure out the exact length tension rods I need. But over the next couple days, I'm going to order all that stuff from Drum Factory Direct. And then I was also able to order a donor bass drum to rob some Spurs, claws, and tension rods from. And that's supposed to show up in the next day or two. And that's a Yamaha Tour Custom drum. It was damaged, so the shell is cracked, but it has a lot of parts there that I can use for this drum set. But then also maybe I can sell some of the extra stuff like lugs or the hoops and offset the cost on what I spent for that drum. And then the last thing I need to get is a tom mount. So I have the Yamaha tom mount coming that I ordered as well. Once all that stuff gets here, I'll be able to put it together and call this set a wrap. Within a week or so, the damaged donor bass drum showed up, and I could get to unboxing it all and breaking it apart to rob the Spurs, tom post plate, and hoop claws from. I was hoping that this shell could be salvaged even partially for some sort of skinny kick or gong drum project, but the crack on the shell went across the entire depth of it, so unfortunately it was pretty much useless. The hoops and heads, on the other hand, were in great shape, which I listed on Reverb, and in the time since editing this video, both have sold, netting me about $90 back on my initial investment for this drum. So after stripping this donor drum entirely, I moved on to the rack tom to install the matching Yamaha Yes mount that I had ordered separately. I'm a big fan of direct-to-shell tom mounting because it's very sturdy and reliable, and this bracket does a good job at not choking the shell or requiring large holes going through for tom arms, so that was a big reason in me choosing to use Yamaha hardware for this kit. I measured out a distance from the top bearing edge that would keep the tom arm placed midway up the shell, and then drilled out 2 small holes for the mounting screws before attaching this bracket on the shell and then reheading it. Moving on to the kick drum, I started with the plate for the tom arm since it was the easiest to place. Again, this was something I measured out probably a dozen times from every angle before actually drilling, but I used a hole saw for the center post and then came back using the rubber gasket as a template for the 4 mounting holes. I then went ahead and attached the bracket in place before moving on to the final step, the kick spurs. I spent a lot of time laying these out and trying to get a feel for the positioning not only up the shell, but how far back they'd be. After figuring all that out and committing to a placement, I repeated the same process of laying out holes, checking my measurement a dozen times, and then punching and drilling holes and checking for fit along the way. After attaching them both to the shell permanently, I reheaded the drum, but this time adding a new Evans EMAD, which I bought using player points on my rewards account, so it ended up being free to me. At this point, after assembling and tuning everything up, I could go ahead and order new tension rods and hoops from Drum Factory Direct, knowing exactly how long I needed the rods to be. After a few days of waiting, that package arrived, and I unboxed those parts to quick swap out the hoops and rods, but I unfortunately discovered that I mistakenly ordered 2 slotted snare side hoops for the 14-inch tom. I still swapped out the tension rods on all the drums and the hoops on the 12-inch tom, but for the 14, I'd have to wait another week or so before wrapping this up, as I needed to order new hoops again. I decided to take this mistake and make it an opportunity to order 2.3mm hoops instead of the 1.6 I originally ordered, just to have a chance to feel the difference and experiment a bit, but once that final package arrived, I was able to quickly swap out the hoops and call this project a wrap. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to hear these drums in a couple different tunings, let's talk about how I think this project turned out as a whole. Obviously, it took a bit longer than I was hoping for, and I think part of that was, one, to get custom shells like this made with a specific recipe of the walnut exteriors and interiors and the maple cores. That's not something that Nordic is doing off the shelf every day. So I couldn't just have them grab something and send it to me. And if you were to order shells from them, maybe like standard maple or one of their signature recipes they offer, I'm sure it would be a lot faster. Now, after they got here, I could get along pretty quickly to finishing, and I'm totally happy with the finish on this kit. I think the satin gloss really lets the wood grain come out. If you watch a lot of like furniture builders on YouTube, I always enjoy seeing the guys who kind of build a lot of stuff with walnut, and so for me, that's kind of my ode to that. Moving on to the hardware, let's talk about the lugs. These lugs from Champagne Drum Company, I think they're beautiful, but what I will say is, if you haven't done a lot of drum building or modifications before, you have to be very precise with your measurements on these. Because there's no swivel nut in this rod and it's just a straight threaded piece of aluminum, there's not a lot of forgiveness if you make an error. Granted, most hoops have a wider hole in them than the actual tension rod, so there's a little bit of forgiveness with your other parts, but I think it's totally worth it. And honestly, they were pretty affordable for something that's handmade and built to order. And if you look at lugs on all the other drum building sites, I think what Champagne is doing is very competitive in that respect. So other than that, the other hardware on the drums, I'm really happy I went with the Yamaha stuff. So that starts here with the tom post. I used their newer tom post here that I ripped off that Tour Custom bass drum. And then we have the Yamaha arm and this Yes mount on the rack tom. I just think this stuff is near indestructible. And I've never had any issues with Yamaha hardware when I've been touring or gigging as a musician. And I really want this kit to be a road warrior for me and survive for a long time. So even though some people might not like the aesthetics of it or don't like the direct to shell mount, I'm really happy with how this has turned out. And I've used this set on maybe a half dozen gigs already, and it's performing really well. The Spurs, I think, were the right decision. In a perfect world, I would like to go with those sort of Spurs that are mounted on floor tom brackets where they kind of fold in that you see on a lot of older vintage kits. My problem with those is that I don't think they're as sturdy, and to me, they're really hard to get in place at every gig. Even with memory locks, I found that I still have to kind of finagle it, set it up, get my drum set up, then make an adjustment, and I just want this to be quick and easy to do and repeatable. So using these kind of traditional modern Spurs, I think, is the right choice for me. And lastly, let's talk about the hoops. Since I did order the wrong hoops by mistake, I decided to go ahead with these 2.3 millimeter hoops. Most of my experience with building drums has been with 1.6 millimeter triple flanged hoops. I was able to try those on these drums until these new ones showed up, and I noticed they're a little bit more open and resonant, and these kind of choke down on the drums, but in a good way, because in the real world, I don't know people who need like the full tom resonance for pop and rock and funk type styles. That's really more of a jazz thing in my opinion. The compromise here is when I put these on, I did notice these drums weighing significantly more. I'm using aluminum lugs, the shells are thin, everything is pretty lightweight, so the hoops made a huge difference on the overall weight of these drums. As far as the portability and convenience, I'm super happy with these. Obviously, with the shells being compromised just a little bit, 12 by 7, 14 by 12, and 20 by 12, it takes up less room in my car, takes up less room on my gig cart, it's easier to haul in, and it takes up a little less room on stage. Aside from that, I'm just kind of like generally fixated on these shallow drums and finding the perfect combination of what's portable and convenient and what goes too far with that, I guess. Before I close out this video, I want to give a huge thank you to Nordic Shells out of Minneapolis. It was a treat to come visit your headquarters in the spring and see how you do everything, and that only makes these shells I have that much more special to me. This project wouldn't have been possible without them, and I'm so grateful for them gifting me these shells to work with. Aside from that, I want to send a shout out to Champagne Drum Company. If you need custom lugs built, definitely reach out to him. And all of you out there who watch those videos and make things like this possible. So I hope it was inspiring to some of you, and let me know what you think of this set overall, and I'll see you on the next one. I almost forgot to mention this until I started editing the video, but in addition to all of the shells that I requested cut down to the depth I asked for, Nordic sent me the cutoff portions from those shells when they made them in the large tubes. So that includes these 3 pieces here. So this one is roughly 12 by 5.5, 14 by 2.5, and then finally 20 by 8.5. So if you have any fun ideas for projects I could do with these remnants, let me know and maybe you'll see them in a future build video. All right, thanks.